So let me just introduce our main speaker today. But I first of all wanted to warmly welcome everyone that has joined us from around the globe. You see here. I've been kind of spinning and dreaming. And I just wanted kind of to name the country because this, normally we have an international audience at our monthly Rome seminar, but people are resident in Rome, although from many different countries, obviously. But in this case, we decided to welcome old friends from afar and to extend the invitation beyond the walls of Rome. And today we have friends from Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Canada, both from French and British Canada, and Kenya, of course, my home nation of the United States. Some of my family joining in from San Diego. And we also have Michigan, New York, and Florida represented. I hope I'm not missing anybody. And then back to Europe, we have people calling in from Germany, Holland, Hungary, Italy. From Italy, we have people joining from the Naples area, from all around Rome, Milan, Verona, and Turin. And then we have a few friends from Poland, one great friend from Ireland, a few friends from India and Pakistan and Lebanon, Nigeria, Spain, United Kingdom, Switzerland, and the great Republic of Texas. Never forget that. Anyways, Victor hails from sunny Florida, and we're very grateful to have his presence with us today. Victor and I met about 13 years ago when I was a wee actinite. I had just joined the forces and attending my first acting university. And Victor was teaching courses for which I needed a better knowledge base. He teaches strictly economics, and if I remember well, he taught on monetary theory. My background is in philosophy and ancient and modern languages. I'm not an economist, although it's one of my passions. And it's one of the fringe benefits of working for the Acton Institute, in that I've had wonderful teachers like Victor instruct me in sort of a core basis of economics. Victor teaches at the Florida Gulf Coast University. He teaches economics in various disciplines, and he's written a couple interesting books, one of which I've read is Economics in Christian Perspective, Theory, Policy, and Life Choices. And the book, which is our interest today, he wrote The Keynesian Revolution and Our Empty Economy. We're all dead. Very prophetic. Anyways, he's a delightful person. Welcome. Welcome, Victor. You want to say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Michael, for your gracious introduction. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, if you permit me just a few more minutes, I'm going to make just a small kind of capstone introduction, and I'm going to share a screen with you, which I sent you this link in the registration email today. And this is the US debt clock. Look at it tick, look at it tick, look at it tick, 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 tick. Every millisecond is going up and up and up. It doesn't go down. It doesn't obey gravity. It only obeys the heavens. But as Victor said, our economy may be dead, and we're hoping for its resurrection. So this is a sign of going up in that capacity. But as you see, the U.S. is it's a big spending economy. It's a consumer economy. This is part of the reason we brought up this crisis. Can we really spend our way out of a giant recession and an imminent depression? And U.S. debt stands at $24 trillion. I don't even want to calculate that into other currencies. In the old lira, that would be like gazillion. I mean, there wasn't even a figure. I mean, I used to earn 2.5 million lira when I first came to Italy. That was worth about $1,500. So 24 trillion lira in lira would be probably 100 gazillion. And that amounts to about 75,000 per living body, per living soul. Those in heaven are freed from debt, and those from hell are paying different debts. But anyways, for all humor aside, it's very useful to kind of stare at this debt clock as kind of like looking at looking at death in the face. So the Grim Reaper is staring at us through the debt. And something we like to ignore, even on a personal anecdotal level. We don't like to look at the money we don't have or the money we owe. It's much better to to spend the little money that we have and to enjoy the pleasures in a sort of tempus fugit. But tempus fugit also is fleeing in terms of the amount of time that we were able to repay the debt. And that's also doubled up by a demographic crisis. We're just not producing enough future babies who will be future workers, who will also contribute wealth back to the national treasury. So as a quick introduction, we were inspired to bring up discussion really about with regard to what President Donald Trump polemically proposed a couple weeks ago with this stimulus deal, and other countries are following suit. Well, President Trump has already issued about $4.5 trillion in stimulus money, and that already increased the clock. The clock is actual; it's in real time. So previously we were looking at about 20 trillion in debt. Now we're 24 trillion. And what basically the main part of the stimulus was helping out average citizens, and those are earning more or less 75,000 per year and less. It's interesting how the debt clock of 70,000 per person is also tied to the average income of 75,000 per citizen, per household. And in actual fact, that President Trump has promised $1,200 per adult parent and $500 per child. I know friends back in America that woke up 2 weeks ago and found $3,000 to $5,000 automatically deposited in their bank accounts. Yeah. One of the things that I've avoided here being in Italy is giving the IRS my bank account information. So that's come back to haunt me, and maybe in a good way. I'm against the stimulus personally and politically. I'm very happy not to take the Trump dollars in this sense. And I think I can get by with my own innovation and new business activity. But anyways, the part of the conversation today is all this has trade-offs. We just can't take money without finding ways to pay it back. Debt comes with payback. And in the stimulus bill, what was also controversial about it is that they were, various other things to care for, not for people. So the initial stimulus went for average income citizens and their children, but then another 2 trillion were divided up in these various, what we call in American political economy, earmarks, which mean kind of special deals that the politicians work out to pay for their kind of pet projects. And some of these earmarks were, I'll just kind of read off a list, a quick tally. 25 million went to the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, Washington, D.C. Who needs to practice ballet right now? We need opera singing, not ballet dancers. Sorry for the ballet dancers in the audience. And then we have another 75 million going for corporate public broadcasting. That's our national public radio, which only feeds us with further misinformation. Then we have another 1.2 billion going to help jet airplanes use renewable jet fuel, whatever that is. Maybe they'll be melting down banana peels in the future to fly jets. And then the other bloat, the other kind of fat on the bone is we have 500 million going to the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Perhaps that's useful, especially libraries, keeping people educated. And then we have another 600 million going for the National Endowment of Arts and Humanities that help with educational cultural products. If that's good used for purposes of promoting human liberty, that's good. And then 250 million to prop up the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, our fiscal police, so that they can have better enforcement. Go figure, they have to start collecting debts immediately. And then another 350 go out to help migration and refugee assistance for Americans abroad who are stuck abroad. And then another 30 million goes to the Department of Education to help support our public school system in the elementary, secondary, and university level. So that's all the background to talk about what is Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is about government injections of funding to help out, to prop up and assist the sick men within the economy, including the average citizens, the entrepreneurs, the various institutional services. And the last time it was supposedly used on this magnitude was during the Great Depression, what we call the New Deal, or what we now call the New Deal today. Are we able to do that again and at the same level? Certainly the amount of funding that's coming from the US Congress is, I've heard it in real time, it's about 100 times more than it was originally passed in the 1930s. So without further ado, I'll take off the screen, and we'll let Victor lead us into discussion.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I'll see if I can get my own technology to cooperate here. So far, it looks very promising.
Victor, I forgot one thing. We have a tradition of just starting this meeting with a quick prayer.
That would be great.
We're Christian brothers and sisters, and I'll just simply lead us in the Our Father, because we need to bring about His kingdom above all. And let's focus on those words within the prayer that our Lord taught us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Today, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass.
And lead us not into temptation.
All right, Victor, everyone mute their microphone now. I'll mute my own.
All right, well, thanks very much for that introduction, Michael. It's great to be with all of you, wherever you happen to be zooming in from, and I look forward to our interaction, especially during the Q&A time. So the title of the talk, and this was Michael's genius. There's a pun on keys and Keynes, and then unlocking the lockdown. So it's quite clever. So the question is, does Keynesianism have the keys to unlock our present economic lockdown? And I think most media in most countries right now, I know for sure here in the United States, it's almost impossible to avoid coverage of coronavirus. It's almost impossible to avoid debates about how much mitigation we need to be doing, how much we need to think about reopening the economy. I know there are many people who are concerned about whether or not, as we stay at home, in order to not enhance the contagion, we're perhaps destroying the long-term productive capacity of the economy. So I think that's one great concern, is will the economy change in a fundamental way so that we won't have the same businesses to go back to? Maybe if the downturn is sufficiently prolonged, then maybe the nature of technology and the production we end up doing in the future will be very different from what we're currently doing. And if that changes, then maybe people who are employable today with their current skill set and their current human capital and current interests, they may not be prepared for whatever the next economy happens to be. I think there's also a consideration that it's an easy thing to be in favor of mitigation, to be in favor of a lockdown, if you're fortunate enough to have a job that allows you to continue to earn your paycheck in the comfort of your home with a very reliable internet connection. And you forget that the people who are most fragile, as is true with almost every crisis everywhere, the people with the most fragile lives, the working poor, the working class, they're the ones who face the greatest potential consequences, because they currently, especially if they're in service or entertainment industries, it's almost impossible for them to work right now. I know my local restaurants in Florida are doing everything that they can to retain their workers. I know they're also doing everything that they can to continue to promote the fact that they are available for carry out and delivery. In many instances, they've moved delivery from something that you used to have to pay for to something that's now provided complimentarily. And there are many questions about what this trade-off is like. The mitigation, because not getting sick is good. Not passing away from COVID-19 is also good, but we're also interfering with the ability of individual human beings to earn a living, to provide for themselves. And we also don't know what the economy will look like once we return. Most economists, despite online petitions that you may have seen to the contrary, most prominent academic economists continue to favor mitigation. Now, not necessarily one-size-fits-all lockdowns, but based on economic history and past pandemics, including the Spanish flu that I'll talk about in just a moment, about 80% of prominent economists surveyed said that the first thing that we need to do is mitigate, because we need to reduce the risk of contagion and the risk of eventual death from a disease that we still don't understand fundamentally very well in terms of who gets it, what the symptoms are like, whether or not once you have the antibodies, whether you have permanent immunity or not. We really don't understand many things about our current illness. So before I talk about whether or not Keynesianism and Keynesian policies can unlock the economy, I think it's worth summarizing briefly this figure, John Maynard Keynes, who was very influential. He published his most famous book in 1936 in the midst of the Great Depression, titled The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And Keynes suggested that it was actually quite an easy thing to manage an economy. And in the event of something like a Great Depression, and I'll show you some numbers in just a moment, government planners, policymakers, people who were humane needed to step in and intervene and restore and shore up any insufficient private demand by using the government purse in order to increase public demand to offset that. And if you do that sufficiently, then you can create a demand for employment where there previously had not been because of the decline in aggregate demand. So in Keynes' view, the cause of a recession or a Great Depression was insufficient demand, and government had a moral obligation to step in and shore up that demand. It's also interesting that Keynes, what was one of the newest things in Keynes was that he recommended spending even if it required going into debt to do so. Because before John Maynard Keynes and before the publication of the general theory, most governments didn't go into significant debt, and they certainly didn't do it on a routine, regular basis, depending on the nature of the particular crisis that you happen to be in. But you saw the national debt clock when we began the presentation today. We're currently at about a debt level that's roughly 115% in the United States of GDP every year. So think about that. We owe more. We've accumulated more debt over time than what we all earn, all put together, doing everything and anything across the economy. We owe more than we can earn in a year. And many professional economists are suggesting that we may rise during the course of the fallout from the pandemic. We may hit something like 150%. Keynes, to his credit, thought that the debt would only be temporary, or whether or not he truly believed it, he argued that the debt that you incurred in a crisis would be offset during the ensuing boom and recovery, because people would be working more, they'd be earning more, the tax base would be larger, and tax revenues would be up during the recovery, and you would be able to retire the debt that you incurred during the crisis. As we all know, that's turned out not to be the case. Government borrows, they go into debt during the crisis, and then that becomes the new normal. I think it's also helpful, especially for an acting audience, to remember that Keynes wasn't simply an academic economist. He had a great love for theater, he had a great love for the arts, he had a great love for literature, and he was heavily influenced by one of his many social circles, a group called the Bloomsbury Group. And this is the cover art from volume 20, number 1 of Acton's special issue about Keynes and moral issues that was published about a year and a half ago. And the Bloomsbury Group was made up of writers, philosophers. They were like-minded intellectual pleasure seekers who disdained traditional values. They thought that religion was a shackle on the true human experience, and that cultural norms impaired and impeded our ability to truly experience life. And life's ultimate pleasures were found, no surprise, in the things that the Bloomsbury Group did and that they also admired. So in their long-term view, economic progress would make it possible for an increasing number of humans to be able to enjoy a rich life experience like the ones that the members of the Bloomsbury Group aspired to. And in fact, things like money and consumerism, they were short-term distractions from the things that really made up a good life in the sense that Keynes had in mind. But of course, only a few were sufficiently enlightened like Keynes and his fellow members of the Bloomsbury group to understand what a good life really looked like. So people needed others to plan for them because they really didn't understand what a good life looked like. But of course, again, it's no surprise that Keynes' idea of who should do the planning is people like Keynes who knew better than the rest of us might. So if you think about Keynes' most famous quote, which was actually published in the decade before the Great Depression, he said famously, "In the long run, we're all dead." And the classic interpretation of that sentence is that it's okay if we have to borrow money today in order to jumpstart the economy today, because we, the living, need to have incomes, and we need to be able to consume goods and services, and we need to be employed. And if we do incur debt, it's a future generation that will have to deal with that. But if you think about the life experience and the views of the Bloomsbury group, "In the long run, we're all dead" didn't refer necessarily.
Okay. All right, Victor, I think you can start again.
All right, so just to review quickly the period that Keynes became quite famous, especially for his economics, the Great Depression. Remember, this was a depression that didn't have a global pandemic attached to it. This was simply a recession. So in many ways, it was, I won't say a preferable situation, but it wasn't as complex a situation as the one we might be entering currently. At the worst of the Great Depression in 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States rose to about 25%. And when you keep in mind that in that period, most women were still working in the household, this really was a large number of Americans who weren't working and earning a paycheck in the economy. And because there were few people working, then we also had much of the nation's productive capacity, the physical capital, that was underutilized as well. We only utilized in the worst year of the Great Depression about 70% of our capacity. So here's a graph of the unemployment rate from the beginning of the Great Depression through more recent times, 2010. This is from my first book that Michael mentioned. And you can see that by modern standards, the unemployment rate that we experienced in the Great Depression was significant, and we haven't really seen anything as close since. Even during the Great Recession of 2008-2009, the US unemployment rate rose as high as 10.2%. I think that was in October of 2010. So this was a recession without a pandemic attached to it. Now, before Keynes, the primary way that economists thought about the economy is they had a strong, firm belief that prices and wages, they adjust swiftly in order to redirect resources of all kinds, from less valuable uses to more valuable uses. So in a classical world, you would expect that if there are too many workers chasing too few jobs in the present, then there should be a downward drift of the money wage that's being paid to workers, because that's typically what happens in a market for anything else. If at the end of ski season, there are leftover skis in your inventory and you'd like to get rid of those, you lower the price and they magically go away. After Easter comes and goes, if you have leftover Easter candy, and retailers had a lot left over this year, you lower the price and it goes away. So the surplus vanishes, but the surplus workforce didn't seem to be vanishing in this period. In fact, the persistent unemployment was quite a concern, even to American economists at the University of Chicago, who were suggesting already, even in the early 1930s, around 1933 or so, that government needed to spend as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And normally you don't think of economists at the University of Chicago as being ones who would advocate significant, rapid fiscal policy in order to combat the worst of the Great Depression. Well, why were many economists captured by Keynes' ideas, and why were even economists like Frank Knight at the University of Chicago recommending that we spend more money during the crisis in the Great Depression? Well, one of the reasons was that the recession was wearing on. It wasn't short-lived, and you saw the numbers, 25% unemployment rate at the worst of the Great Depression. That's a big number, and it was a persistent number. Also, the success of the Allies in World War I had created some space for people to ponder whether or not government planning could be effective, not just in wartime, but perhaps also in peacetime. If government planning had successfully won victory in Europe, maybe it could also win the peace as well. So the focus of Keynes' 1936 book isn't a Great Depression. It's any movement away from full employment, any movement away from what economists would refer to as potential GDP. And while the classicals focused on equilibrium, where you would land eventually once wages and prices had time to adjust, that was the focus of the classicals. The focus of Keynes was on the disequilibrium situations, because that was most of the time. Right, it's Panglossian to be a classical and focus on equilibrium, because that's the best of all possible worlds. And on any given day, you're not in the best of all possible worlds. You're somewhere near full employment, but you're not necessarily on top of it. So Keynes favored a more active role for all kinds of policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy. He thought that even in times that were not crisis times, government management of the economy would be preferable to a laissez-faire approach to the economy. So in this sense, Keynes envisioned economists as master jugglers, who even in a very complex economy of $22 trillion and 350 million Americans in my case,
We've lost Victor.
Victor, you need to take off your mute. You've been muted.
Okay, how much did you miss, Michael? Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, did you miss much?
Just about 15 seconds, so.
Oh, okay. All right, then I'll just move to the next slide then. So the legacy of Keynes, and there's another famous quote circulating where Keynes compares the impact that economists could eventually have to something as mundane as going to the dentist, right? The dentist can see that you have a cavity forming, see it in the x-ray, persuade you that you need the treatment, and within a half hour or an hour, it's completely finished. And so Keynes really thought that economic management of the economy didn't necessarily need to be big and significant. We didn't need to hand over the keys of the economy to the economists. All we needed to do was trust the economists to do fairly mundane things, be more like dentists or carpenters and plumbers. So in the beginning of the Great Depression, Keynes again famously said, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, then that would be a splendid thing. So government management, economic policy management, even in good times, not in a crisis, was necessary, but it's something that economists could manage relatively effectively. The irony, of course, is that economists like me are very frustrated sometimes because we have the least influence in areas that we know the most about. International trade and trade wars, how you should try to get people to mitigate pollution. We feel like we understand those policy things very well, but politically, our ideas about what good policy looks like, they fall on deaf ears, or they're subject to partisan debates, even though economists are convinced that they understand some of those policies extremely well, including trade. When it comes to macroeconomics, there's more disarray and division among macroeconomists regarding what's fundamentally going on with an economy at any given time and what the appropriate course of treatment might be. So given that there's division among the macroeconomists, macroeconomic management can never be something as simple and mundane as Keynes envisioned when he uttered this famous sentence about dentists. So let's turn to our present crisis. This is the Google map of the coronavirus, and I pulled this last night. You can see where the hotspots are. They're typically on the east coast of the United States and throughout much of Europe. And the number of confirmed deaths as of, I think, about 10 p.m. or so Florida time was about 177,000. And our present crisis is interesting because we have only the crisis caused by the coronavirus to fight against. The economy was doing relatively well, not just within the United States, but globally in general. So we introduced the coronavirus, economically speaking, at a time that wasn't that bad. If you were going to have a pandemic, 2020 wasn't necessarily a bad time to have it. Also, unlike the Spanish flu that I'll talk about more in a moment, we weren't in the immediate wake of a world war. November 1918 was the year that we celebrated victory in Europe. And it was also, there was the month that we celebrated victory in Europe. And it was also the month when deaths from the Spanish flu pandemic reached their peak. Another advantage we have compared to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 is that we understand medicine much better than we did during the pandemic. In 1918, the idea that all of the death could have been caused by something like a virus was something that wasn't understood well at all. So much of the effort initially focused on bacterial infection rather than viral infection. But today, the pandemic is causing a recession. You don't have to be a professional economist with a PhD to look at jobs numbers, weekly jobless claims from the last several weeks in the United States, and figure that the unemployment rate currently is probably somewhere around 15 or 16%, and likely will be higher for the month of March once we see those first numbers for the month of March in early April. So already the recession that we're causing because of our mitigation efforts is more significant than the Great Recession, at least in terms of the spike that we'll see in unemployment rates, certainly in the United States and in other parts of the globe as well. So in many ways, the lockdown is compounding our current crisis. Our crisis isn't merely an economic one. It's also not merely a medical one. It's both. And so the question that many are asking today is, where's the cost-benefit analysis on this? How much should we be focusing on social distancing and staying at home and not being a risk to others through our going out into the marketplace and the shops and visiting with our friends and neighbors? How prudent do we need to be there relative to the fact that many people, including the most fragile individuals, are losing their livelihood, and they're struggling to do things like pay their rent, pay their mortgage, pay their bills, and they're not sure whether they'll have a job when they return to the economy, whenever that is. So we focus currently on two questions. The first one is, will our present treatment be worth the cost, right? We're all staying at home, doing the right thing. We're getting frustrated. And I don't know about you, around week 5 or 6, I think I'll be very, very frustrated indeed and be ready to do just about anything else besides doing the right thing. And then the question that we have to ask ourselves later is, given that we seem to be causing a recession because of the mitigation, because of the lockdown, is doing nothing in the future a better prescription for the economy than trying to more actively do something in the ways that Michael has already summarized, as well as, I'm sure, additional fiscal policy proposals that will come into being as we continue to make our way through this coronavirus period, as well as the recession that we're causing. I think as an economist, it's helpful to look back at the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, of course, it was 100 years ago. It was 1918. But I think there are some things that we've learned from that particular pandemic that are useful in terms of how we balance and try to find the cost-benefit balancing point between lockdown and emerging and returning to the economy and being productive. The Spanish flu was devastating. Nearly 1/3 of the world's population in 1918 contracted the virus. In 2020, the surge in the demand for goods and services here in the United States has been for things like hand sanitizer and toilet paper and Clorox wipes. In 1918, because we didn't understand medicine very well, in fact, we thought it was caused by a bacterium and not a virus, there was a surge in demand for things like beds and mattresses because so many Americans were spending their time at home convalescing and trying to survive from the illness. It was also different in terms of where the mortality was the greatest. With our current crisis, it's older Americans, older individuals, normally 60 or 65 or older, who are the most susceptible to complications arising from COVID-19 and ultimately perishing and not being removed from a ventilator once they're put on one. With the Spanish flu pandemic, in terms of our productive capacity, it was actually more devastating. The greatest death totals tended to be among younger people, normally between about 20 years of age and 40 to 50 years of age. So people who were in the prime of their working years were the ones who were the most likely to perish from the coronavirus or from the Spanish flu. And the death total was unimaginable. Estimates are that about 600,000 Americans perished during our Civil War, and that's more than in any other global conflict, either at home or abroad, because it was Americans killing other Americans. The death count from the Spanish flu pandemic was even bigger still. It was 675,000. So more Americans perished from the Spanish flu pandemic than did from the American Civil War. So I think the lessons that we've learned from the Spanish flu pandemic are first to try to contain the spread and mitigate it. And I'll talk about some numbers in just a moment, but it does seem like mitigation at the beginning, while it's short-term extremely disruptive to the economy, over the longer term, the likelihood that the economy will bounce back rapidly and well does seem to turn on how significant and early mitigation happens. And then we can respond, and I think we're doing a good job of responding. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the forecasts of both cases and deaths is now so much lower than it was earlier during the crisis. And then finally, we need to ultimately pursue economic recovery, and nobody knows for sure what exactly that economic recovery might look like. Well, here's an encouraging slide. Now, this is from the Angus Madison data set, but I like this clip art from Mother Jones because it's really visually arresting, and because a marketing person put this together, the diagram looks sharper than anything this economist could do on his own. But these are per capita GDP numbers from the beginning of the 1900s forward until well after the Spanish flu pandemic. And if the years of the Spanish flu pandemic weren't shaded here for you, you might not even realize that there had been something as devastating as the Spanish flu pandemic that took the lives of 675,000 Americans. So the good news is, even though there might be significant individual interruptions, even though there might be significant death, especially among older Americans, and let's make no mistake about it, the lives of individuals were changed in fundamental, devastating, consequential ways during the Spanish flu pandemic. If you zoom out and you look at how well we recovered as an economy, the numbers are actually quite encouraging from this period. And remember, this was at the end of a war, and we lost 675,000 Americans who were in the prime of their working lives. So why did we bounce back in ways that, especially since medicine wasn't that great at the time and the disease wasn't understood well, how did we bounce back so quickly? One reason is that in the case of the Spanish flu pandemic, the mitigation efforts were much more significant and early as you moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, because the spread of the virus happened in that manner from the American East Coast to the West Coast. Western cities were much more likely to adopt mitigation that was significant and earlier as a consequence. And so cities, for example, like Seattle, bounced back overall much more quickly than cities like Philadelphia that had been destroyed by the global pandemic in 1918. It's also encouraged to remember that despite fighting a war, despite a terrible consequential pandemic, the global pandemic of 1918 gave rise to a decade that we refer to romantically as the Roaring '20s. So not only did the economy recover, it recovered in a way that we view as historically significant. So what are some lessons, what are some takeaways for us as we examine our current crisis in light of what we've learned economically and medically from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918? One thing that I'm confident about as an economist is that significant disruptions give rise to significant entrepreneurial responses. There's simply no limit to the human ingenuity that can make advances possible as people figure out how to do new things in new ways, or even old things in new ways, because they have to deal with the immediate consequences for them and their friends and neighbors and people in their community as they deal with ever-changing circumstances. Another thing that I know is that these disruptions lead to entrepreneurial responses when government does everything it can to reduce uncertainty in the decision-making environment. I think there are many businesses and many individual Americans who are having a hard time deciding whether to return to work or to continue to stay at home because they don't know well what government might do next. No one imagined that we would have already spent $4 trillion in our efforts to fight the coronavirus. And I think many people are wondering whether they should take a wait and see approach to the economy or move forward. But they're holding back because of the uncertainty that government itself has created. Even though it's 2020 and not 1918, our current pandemic still isn't well understood in terms of who it affects, how they're affected, whether they're symptomatic or not. We're learning every single day new things about this disease. It does seem to be the case, based on current data and also data from the Spanish flu pandemic, that early mitigation areas will tend to see smaller long-term economic consequences. Again, especially in things like restaurants, other service sector jobs, entertainment. They'll see smaller long-term economic consequences, though with very high short-term economic costs. And those costs will be felt the most significantly and severely by the working poor and the working class. Again, service industries in particular. Also, many of these jobs tend to be concentrated in areas that are otherwise well-to-do and tend to be quite urban in nature. And remember that this population, the uninsured and underinsured, even in the presence of the Affordable Care Act, there are nevertheless many Americans who don't have sufficient medical insurance in the event that they get sick, and possibly no insurance at all. One thing that's nice is the economy tends to be more dynamic in 2020 than it was 102 years ago. It's much more likely that people might be willing to relocate to a new job opportunity. It's also more likely that they might find out that there's a new job opportunity in another state or another town that requires them to relocate. 120 years ago, it was almost impossible to find out whether or not your particular skill set and interests was a good fit for a job even 100 miles away. And then finally, even though our global connectivity has probably led to more contagion, at least initially, because we do fly around in airplanes and we interact with people from all across the globe, from different cultures, different races, different societies. Our greater connectivity and an international supply chain upon which we can draw should both shorten and flatten any consequential downturn that we experience as a result of the coronavirus. So in sum, I would say that there are two lessons from the Spanish flu pandemic for the American economy today and the global economy today. The first one is, be a good citizen. Don't take unnecessary risks. If you don't have to go to the store, don't. When you do go to the store, try to economize on that trip. Start making a list. Dutifully make a list. This is something that I've had to be much more focused on. Make sure that you reduce the likelihood that you'll spread the virus, because again, we know already that there are people who are asymptomatic, yet are carriers of the disease. So your mitigation efforts today will pay off tomorrow. Also, if we mitigate today, we'll have more survivors as a consequence. And the true wealth of any society, really, I know it sounds like a cliche, but the true wealth in any society really does lie in its people. This is one of the mistakes that the Soviets made. The Soviets saw people as mouths to feed and problems to solve, but we're not. People are the solution. And the more survivors we have from our current crisis, the more productivity we'll have available to work our way out of the recession that we're entering currently. And then my advice to the economists, be humble. Don't be overconfident. And in fact, don't introduce uncertainty into the decision-making environments of the lives of millions and billions of individuals. Instead, meddle less, trust human ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and creativity more, and we'll recover at least as well as America did from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And if you'd like some other resources, and I'll leave the slide here for a moment, my grad school buddy Tom Garrett literally wrote the book on a future pandemic for the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank when he was there, and you can look at the PDF of it for free online. It's Economic Effects of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, Implications for a Modern Day Pandemic. So Tom was already considering the coronavirus as early as 2007. And then there's a wonderful short feature article from Mother Jones, and that's where my clip art is from. And the title is "The Coronavirus Pandemic Probably Won't Have a Huge Economic Impact." And it also refers to the Spanish flu pandemic as well as some others. And if you'd like to learn more about Keynes, my book is also available. The really good news is it goes into paperback in June, so you can have it for a pittance relative to the hardcover price. Thanks very much. And Michael, let's open it up for some questions.
Heck me. I have to reappear as the invisible man. Victor, you need to take down the share screen.
Oh, thanks.
Not that I'm more beautiful than your PowerPoints, but
oh, but you are.
We like competition, but you know, not when it's about me and you. Yeah, that was an absolutely thorough and fascinating lecture. You know, I must say, you know, I fell in love with Acton University by taking your course 13 years ago. And I continue to, you know, in a way, sometimes want to work for free. It's such core thinking, and it's really going back to basics, as our mission is at the Acton Institute, going back to core anthropological issues. And a lot of the economic issues depend on these core precepts of human behavior. I just want to ask you the first question before we turn to our audience. You know, you're from Florida, and Florida, like my home state of Arizona, are the two most populous states in terms of retirees, lots of pensioners. Can you make some type of general comment about whether these elderly people who are already most at risk in terms of contracting the contagion for health reasons? They have many underlying conditions at a late age in life, and as they're sunsetting, but they're also sunsetting financially, and a lot of their pensions are tied to stocks. So as as the stock market is slowly melting, in turn, so is their pension funds and savings. Can you just make a state about their economic state of health?
Yeah, it's really a curious thing that you're right. We do have incredible density, both from retirees and also snowbirds. Keep in mind that this hit during the spring, and that's when the snowbirds are all present, whether they're over here on the Gulf Coast side in cities like Naples and Fort Myers, or whether they're over on the Atlantic side in places like Fort Lauderdale and Miami. If you look at the case number though, and the New York Times, everybody I think is very familiar with the New York Times interactive map that's updated every few hours. Yeah. The density of both contracting the disease and also deaths from the disease are much lower than you would expect given the particular demographics that you've identified. So I don't know that there's a great answer to that. Part of it might be that many snowbirds, when they saw that this was happening, they returned home. And so they went home early. And so they would normally be here. These older Americans who would normally be here until about April 15th, they had already moved out of the area. So they're not going to turn up in our local data. Another possibility might actually, and people have speculated about this, whether weather matters and whether higher temperatures actually make the coronavirus less damaging than it would otherwise be. And then finally, I do think that we moved fairly early with mitigation. In the case of my university, we came back from spring break for 3 days. in early March. And then the next day, everything was going to be online delivery. And so I think many individuals, even without a mandate, responded in ways that they thought were prudential at the time and weren't willing to take unnecessary risks. And I think that was really good news. And then I think Florida's willingness to have a stay-at-home order with a lot of flexibility to it, and that's not a mandate and that isn't being relentlessly policed in silly ways that turn up in TMZ. I think we're all really thankful that everybody is trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. I mean, part of the problem here with public debt in Italy is that the pensioners are living off of Social Security, as it were. Here it's called INPS. The Italian government announced that they were not promising pension payments past the end of May.
Wow.
Even the Italian coffers live on kind of a month-to-month basis. Like they have about 2 months of cash flow.
Yeah. And the U.S. circumstance is better than that, but it's not significantly better than that. Everybody's got a long-term crisis.
Okay. We have a very intricate question from Mario Fantini in Vienna.
Great.
You want to come on, Mario? Can you hear me?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Victor.
Hey, Mario.
Greetings to everybody. Very quickly, some of what you said reminded me of Nassim Taleb, with the whole anti-fragile argument, because you said that these disruptions, no matter how deadly, like this pandemic, lead to significant entrepreneurial ventures and solutions. And my question is, and maybe you're not the right guy to ask this, but like, how can we be more conscious of this so that we can take advantage of situations like the current crisis, so that we can become better entrepreneurs? See where I'm going with that? Thank you.
I do, and it's the hardest thing, and it's what Bastiat referred to with his broken window fallacy, right? That you can see what you're doing, but you can't see what would have emerged spontaneously had you stepped away. I think what some economists can do is they can point to the Spanish flu pandemic as one obvious instance where we learned a whole lot, and it wasn't just about entrepreneurship in business. It was also all of the things that we learned that survive today in terms of the way that we address medicine and the way that we deliver it. It really got medical personnel to be much more entrepreneurial in their approach to medicine because it created a new crisis and a new problem to solve. So I'm an economist, even though economics is sometimes referred to as the dismal science. I tend to be a pretty hopeful guy. And I do think that we do have these periods when if you give people the freedom and opportunity to discover how to be of service to somebody else, and you stop being a source of uncertainty yourself, if you're in a position of power, then the landing normally is a softer and faster landing than we would experience otherwise. But it's a hard case, especially if you're a politician seeking re-election, to say that a hands-off approach may be superior to giving a daily press conference about all of the things that you're doing and not doing. But another way to think about this is, if you think about and because I live in the United States, you can't miss them. If you think about the press conferences, especially from people like Governor Cuomo, just a few weeks ago, he was clamoring for 40,000 ventilators and said that if the state of New York didn't get them, then somebody would have to choose who lives and dies. Well, it turned out that we didn't need anything close to 40,000 ventilators. So even over something simple like that the governor seemed quite confident about, it turned out that forecast was mistaken. And part of the reason it was mistaken is we didn't understand the disease well, and we also didn't understand how effective mitigation could be, even in a city as densely populated as New York.
Okay. I want to call on Ruth.
Thank you so much, Victor. Thank you.
Everyone, please mute their audio. Father Charles, your audio is on again. Ruteri from Kenya, can you come on with your question? Hello? Okay. Ruteri, may you not be, are you still there? If not, we have Elias Sauter, who's in Rome, but Lebanese. Would you like to ask your question, Elias?
Yes, Victor, thank you for all the insights. And my question is about mainly now in the economy, I know that a lot of parts of the economy were disrupted, but some parts continued almost in a way to continue working from home through all the opportunity that technology have offered for all of us. I can say what is your take, but also I need to ask you about what's your take and how do you see the next move about this working from home that is in a way changing our way and the how to call it 9 to 5 model of working.
Yeah, I think that that'll probably end in one of two ways. Either people will discover that they have more freedom than they've ever had before, and so we might see even more individuals telecommuting because it worked reasonably well and for some purposes. I think there are other purposes, though, where people desperately want a return to the normalcy and the sorts of conversations, productive conversations that can happen when people are present together in a workplace. It's hard to have a great new idea over a cup of coffee if you're not physically together. I know I'm an academic. I know many departments are trying to do this. In fact, this morning, we have a club at 9 a.m. on Mondays. It's called our 9 a.m. on Wednesdays, and it's called our Social Distance Coffee Club. And we get together dutifully every week at 9 a.m., but it's just not the same as the more personal one-on-one or one-on-two conversations from which ideas are generated. I also think that this will be true for the delivery of university education. I think there are some institutions that will discover that online delivery with advanced preparation works really well for them. But I like to think that many institutions like mine that take serving our on-campus students very seriously, I'm hopeful and encouraged to think that our students will discover that even very intentional online delivery is a poor substitute for the sorts of engagement and interactions that you can have in a classroom, not only with your instructor, but also with each other.
Okay, Victor, we're gonna go up to Milan now, one of the hardest hit cities, and our dear friend Maria Claudia. Hello, Maria Claudia, are you there?
Yes, okay, I'm here.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Hello, Maria Claudia.
Hello, thank you for your lecture, very good. So my question is on the fall of the demand for goods that are not food or sanitizers and medicines right now.
Right.
Because I'm sure that in Italy, in the medium term, I hope not in the long term, this fall of the demand will last. So of course we don't want the government to support the demand, but what are you foreseeing? And because you say, of course, our entrepreneurial spirit of the people can lead to a recovery, a very quick recovery, to a new activity, and so to a new demand. But it will not be in the short term, because I'm sure that people will not go immediately to restaurants or bars and cinemas and theaters. They will not travel. They will not travel far. They will not go to hotels. I mean, at least in the next few months. And the other question is on deregulation, because no one, of course, in Italy it doesn't happen, it won't happen. No one is talking about deregulation as a mean to recover, to let the market free to produce goods and everything, even medical tests and so on, you know. Everything is centralized in Italy, and the trade unions have asked to private laboratories not to do COVID tests. This is the situation right now.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, let me address both of those. First, regarding the demand, this is something else that happened during the pandemic of 1918. There were many retail businesses in the United States, and let's face it, at that point, all of the business was in person, right? It was brick and mortar. You couldn't go online and purchase goods and services. There were many businesses that failed. Many saw, I think, the average decrease in revenues in the retail, especially service sector part of the economy. The average loss in revenues was about 50% in some of the cities that were most prominently affected by the Spanish flu pandemic. And whether or not firms have the financial capital to remain viable during this period I think is a great question. I guess there are a couple of possibilities. One is Firms that were already approaching a crisis anyway, well, it's possible that it's a terrible thing to lose your business, but if you were already on that path to losing the business eventually anyway, in many cases, COVID will hasten that loss of the business that was going to come as a consequence. I think that's one of the reasons why so many Americans are critical of some of the bailout money and the loan money that we've made available, because we don't know whether we're loaning it to a responsible business that will survive or one that was already in dire straits. And so I think there's some concern that we don't have great knowledge about who we're lending the money to and whether or not they needed it in order to sustain the business. I'll say personally, I don't know about other people, I'm not doing a lot of online shopping in this period, even though I can have home delivery. My credit card bill has looked great the last 6 weeks or so because I'm not buying the goods and services that I would normally buy if I were out and about. So I can see that, and I think that I'm probably not alone. So how existing businesses will make it through, that remains a question. I think we may also see brand new businesses start up as a consequence. And this sort of returns us to the second question. Can you just summarize the second question for me again, Maria?
No, the
the
question is
question.
the regulation one of the options?
Exactly.
And maybe in the United States, someone is talking about the regulation, because here in Italy, of course, it won't happen, unfortunately.
It's thrilling to me as an economist to see all of the things all of the regulations we suspend in a crisis.
Okay.
Because we know that there are limitations. We know that there are handcuffs. We know that there are shackles. And then what do we do when there is a crisis? We decide, oh, well, I guess we can unchain ourselves now because we really need the resource. Well, this is silly, right? If something is a handicap in a crisis, it's also a handicap the rest of the time as well. So one of the things that's encouraging is even simple things. You can now, with your carry-out meal from a nice restaurant, they will give you a carry-out mixed drink, a carry-out cocktail. A month ago, that would have been unheard of. But we've decided that, well, I guess regulating alcohol isn't as essential as we thought it would be, and so we're willing to do this. We saw this briefly in the fallout from the hurricane that affected Puerto Rico so badly. There's a shipping law in the United States called the Jones Act, and we temporarily suspended the Jones Act because the Jones Act made it very difficult for goods and services to get from the American mainland to Puerto Rico in the aftermath. And so we decided, no, the Jones Act, it's not that essential. So I'm encouraged that during these times of disruption, we discovered that some things really are impairments. They really are handicaps, not only in the crisis, but also during better times as well. And if it begins a conversation about what regulations we could unwind because we're only constraining human capacity and possibility and long-term growth, I think that's very encouraging to me. But what that conversation looks like will vary from country to country.
Yeah, that's for sure. Italy, we're living on the edge. We've got about 2 weeks left until we lose control of the situation. It's already becoming quite desperate.
Yeah.
The last couple of weeks have been quite challenging in terms of my own personal Christian charity. We're all suffering economically with salary reductions and such, and I have friends who are literally have nothing left, and they're SME entrepreneurs with fashion stores, and small business. One of my friends is a car parts retail salesman, and it's nothing, and it's so we're gonna have to make a big decision whether we have to go back and innovate and resurrect this dead economy. It's certainly not going to be done through public spending. There's no money in the coffers either to do some type of stimulus here.
And we're also not engaging in the economic activity that generates revenues, right? When we're locked down, we're not taxing, we're not collecting revenues that would otherwise be collected. You're exactly right.
I'd just like to call the last question. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to come in spontaneously and ask Victor one last question.
May I ask the next question?
Yeah, say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, my name is Muhammad Anas and I'm from India. I'm from Mumbai.
Hi, Muhammad.
Hello, Victor. Thank you so much for this lecture. It was indeed insightful. My question for you is that in India, we also have, so we have like the harshest lockdown. We had a 21-day lockdown of all economic activity now, followed by another 2-week lockdown, which brings us to another crisis of migrant workers who have a food-to-mouth existence. So it's very difficult for them to survive without any economic activity. And we have seen very disturbing scenes coming out because they're starving. My question is that in such a case, is it economically efficient for the government to provide them direct cash transfers? And whether, I mean, if you have a predetermined outcome of what you're doing, is it efficient and feasible? I mean, the most feasible thing would be to lift the lockdown, but in another case, do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I think the challenge is everybody wants to do the right thing and the humane thing because we know that because it's through no one's fault, we now exist in a crisis. And as you summarized brilliantly, it's people who are the most fragile, who are the most likely to be devastated as a consequence. I think that, you know, government efforts, while noble and charitable and often carried out for the right reasons, they just don't have the particular knowledge about an individual's particular circumstances. And that's what's missing. A one-size-fits-all policy doesn't fit anyone, right? If you go to a shoe store and all they have is size 9, the probability that it fits you is very, very small indeed. And that's what happens with government efforts to shore up this gap. And sometimes in an effort to do the right thing, we create perverse incentives. One of the things that's being debated right now in the United States is because the money that was allocated for hourly workers who have a job separation, it was so generous that some workers have in fact asked their employers to be furloughed so that they can collect not only their state-provided, their US state-provided unemployment insurance, but the additional supplemental money as well, because they can actually earn more, well, not earn more, but receive more money if they're fired and furloughed, rather than if they continue to work at their job at a business that really needs them and would love to pay them, but it's not financially possible anymore. And so I think that government efforts are noble, but nobody possesses the particular knowledge that will help each individual in precisely the way that individual could be most effectively served.
Right. So Victor, let's bring out your magic wand. Here's the last question for the economic wizard. Okay, and this comes from my sister in San Diego, who's she must be having a bad hair day.
Okay.
She doesn't want to come on camera. She says, "What do you suggest the American government should do to knock down that $24 trillion debt besides raising taxes? Is there no way out of debt situation without tax increases?" So you can just kind of sum up your anti-Keynesian views.
Yeah, there really isn't a great long-term solution to incurring so much debt. You know, David Ricardo was onto this hundreds of years ago, that if you spend money today that you don't have, then at some point, sometime, you're going to have to collect tax revenue in order to retire that debt. The way that most governments operate in the 21st century is you just continue to accumulate debt, and then part of your budget is servicing that debt. And it's really helpful if you as a government entity have manipulated interest rates to zero so that you can make the political argument that now is a great time to borrow because we can borrow at 0% interest rates. This is a very convenient thing, and this is the sort of thing that courts long-term peril, as Keynes himself realized. You know, he did realize that in the long run, we'll all be dead. And remember, Keynes thought we would earn the money back during the recovery.
Yeah. Well, just kind of end on a metaphor in terms of electrical energy. Rita had just got kicked off because her power grid was overloaded. And this is frequently happening in Italy around 7 o'clock as all the ovens are turned on. Now, Italians love to bake, and they're baking their own bread. You can't find yeast in the stores anymore. So it's been up. And, you know, the last time we did this, it happened to me, the power shut off in my home. So these are not sort of metaphorical signs. These are literal signs about how stressed the grid is, you know, economically, energetically, personally, spiritually. And we pray that we just have the courage to go back to work, and whatever happens, you know, my sister's question of, you know, canceling the 24 trillion debt. I mean, I imagine cyanide caplets. I mean, it's the only way out. It's kind of that's a very dire thought, but I don't see any way of paying back 24 trillion. I mean, it just,
and the people we borrowed the money from, they do expect to be paid back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cyanide caplets really translate into no new life. People just won't be having children, won't be getting married, and so the unborn will never, you know, have a chance. So it's literally a suicide for a new life, not just in terms of our present life. So it's what, you know, we started with our meeting with a prayer. You know, God is the real miracle worker. We've done our part. The government maybe has done too much of its part. And the private citizen, especially the entrepreneur, the creative among us, need to really dig down deep and do something miraculous in terms of our natural human gifts. Having said that, let's all give a round of applause. You can turn your microphones on and say thank you to Victor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Victor.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
I promise, Vic, I'm going to send an anytime drone your way and deliver you a sweet present.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.